I'm George Galloway, and I present Kali Mahorra on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kali Mahorra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kali Mahorra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kali Mahorra with me, George Galloway, coming to you from London on Al Mayadeen television, but discussing Iran and China. Could hardly be further away geographically, yet the 25-year strategic partnership just signed by those two countries, both of them to an extent the enemy of much of the Western world, may have lasting consequences for all of us. You may say it's the law of unintended consequences kicking in. If you ostracize, sanction, display military aggression towards two countries at the same time, the logical thing is that those two countries will be forced to draw closer together. That's what's happened between Russia and China. It's what's happened between Russia and Iran. And now it's what's happened between the beleaguered Islamic Republic of Iran and the world's second most powerful economy, most populous country, the country to which the future surely belongs, has been forced into Iran's corner as a strategic ally. Don't underestimate the use of the word strategic. This is not explicitly a military alliance, but strategic is more than a here today, gone tomorrow relationship. This is not a flirtation. This is a marriage between Iran and China, from which both hope to gain a great deal of happiness, as anyone who gets married intends to do. The Iranians will provide energy, oil in particular, to the Chinese at specially discounted rates. China will provide Iran with massive investment in Iranian infrastructure, in all kinds of infrastructure, including the internet, for example. Both parties hope to benefit mightily. And so it's a fair bet that the United States, Great Britain, the European Union are kind of hoping that it fails. Maybe they'll even, or some of their friends will, try to make it fail. But if it succeeds, it's a game changer in the Middle East and marks another sign that China has arrived in the area. China has long deliberately refrained from exercising the kind of political, even military influence that its economic size and the size of its population would normally demonstrate. But China is beginning to change. Its legendary caution is beginning to wane. And with the waning of that caution, they're ready to put their nose, their hand, their feet into places that anger the United States a very great deal, and Iran angers the United States more than anywhere else. Quite irrationally, you may say, but undeniably. Now, Maedeh Sharifi is a broadcast journalist and presenter, writer for TRT World, a degree in international relations, and I'm glad to say she's one of our distinguished experts here on the panel today. Maedeh, how do you calculate or calibrate the importance of this deal?
Thank you for having me, George. I believe the deal definitely has some symbolic value in terms of diplomacy. The US, particularly under Trump and his maximum pressure campaign, have attempted to diplomatically isolate Iran. And from Iran's perspective, this deal is more of a message to the United States, like, look, you've tried to diplomatically isolate us, but we've just made a deal with one of the most powerful and global economies in the world. However, at the same time, just following on from what you said, it is more of an intention of where these relations can go in ideal circumstances. And those ideal circumstances will, of course, be with the uplifting of US sanctions. I don't think it's in the best interest of both Iran and China to return back to the nuclear deal and have the sanctions lifted. However, it is definitely an intent, but I wouldn't say it is an axis of resistance of any kind. It has happened in the face, in the backdrop of the US international policy of imposing sanctions over Xinjiang, and of course, inheriting the sanctions from Trump. Joe Biden still hasn't reversed those sanctions, and both China and Iran are against US global dominance and do view the US sanctions as a form of bullying. So when you take that in perspective, it is easier to look at this deal as a way of challenging US hegemony. And it's definitely symbolic of that. But I think China will be more hesitant about replacing the global order or US hegemony in the region. But I'll get back to that a bit later.
I'm sure you will. Duncan Bartlett, you're a very considerable expert in the region, editor of Asian Affairs magazine, research associate at the School of Oriental and African Studies and the China Institute at University College London, and with a journalistic and broadcasting career before that. It is a memorandum of understanding rather than a contract, isn't it? It's an MOU, it's a signal of intent, as Maedeh says. Will it bear out in reality, do you think, in the way the Iranians obviously hope?
Well, two things in particular strike me about this deal, George. One is how long-term it is, and secondly, the very large amount of money involved. It's a 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership. You know, the Chinese, they love to talk about 5-year plans, 10-year plans, 25-year plans, century-long plans. So they do think long-term in terms of foreign policy. And as you mentioned in your introduction, China is becoming more assertive globally as a result of its economic rise, and particularly under the leadership of Xi Jinping. The second thing is the sheer amount of money involved. We're talking here about an investment of the equivalent of 400 billion US dollars. Now, that's enough to transform any country, but particularly at this stage, because Iran's economy has been profoundly affected by the US-led sanctions. It's caused a drop in the value of the currency, soaring inflation. Of course, people in Iran are going to be welcoming this Chinese investment. But I do have a word of concern, I have a caution actually. Will this money from China actually benefit ordinary Iranian citizens? Because this sudden big influx of foreign money, will it just benefit the elite and those connected with the oil industry? How far will it reach?
Heaven forfend something might just benefit the elite. Iran would be unusual if that were to happen. Zayd Alisa, another expert, political analyst, Middle East expert and writer, and activist for that matter. Do you share Duncan's anxiety on that front, and how do you see this deal?
Well, I see this deal as been in the works since 2016, since the visit of Jinping, the president of China, to Iran. It is basically supposed to be a massive, huge deal. And the objective, according to the Chinese and Iranians, is to strengthen their political and economic ties. The Chinese have said this will promote and scale up the relationship into a strategic partnership, which basically lessen the impact of the current situation. And I do believe it comes at a vital, crucial moment when both Iran and America have expressed their willingness to go back to the nuclear deal, which was struck in 2015. It will give Iran, at this particular moment, political leverage. It will give it an extra bargaining chip that is in the negotiation. It will dramatically strengthen its hand at this crucial moment, and it would send a clear message to the Americans. You have worked tirelessly, extremely hard to isolate and to ostracize, sideline Iran, and totally encircle Iran. Now, the Chinese have come to the aid of the Iranians, and that's why the position of the Chinese have come under intense criticism from the US and from the West. It also throws a lifeline to the Iranians in terms of highlighting the need for Iran to look eastwards and to break free from this vicious, continuous cycle of perpetual sanctions, which have lasted nearly for 40 years, unheard, unprecedented, monstrous sanctions against the Iranian people, trying to force them to turn against their elected government. And for the Chinese, it will enable them to have access through the strategic location of Iran to the warm waters of the Gulf, which the Americans have always considered their private lake. It will provide an opening for the Chinese to actually play a significant role in the Middle East, and to have also leverage against the Americans, sending a clear message that if you try to hurt our sphere of influence or take the fight to China, we are willing and ready as well to counter that and respond and take the fight to your area or sphere of influence. One last important point we mustn't forget is that although China relies on Saudi Arabia for energy, but what has been viewed and seen clearly is that this is not a secure and safe source of energy, because Saudi Arabia has been basically playing to the American tune. If the Americans say jump, then Mohammed bin Salman and King Salman will say how high. But relying on Iran as a source of energy provided with a more durable, more sustainable, and a source of energy that, according to the foreign minister of China, has clearly said that we are dealing with a country who is proud of its foreign policy, is not willing to change its position after a single phone call coming from
Well, let's
the US.
get the view from Iran, from Dr. Hamed Mousavi, who's in Tehran. He's the assistant professor of political science at the Faculty of Law and Political Science at the University of Tehran.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Mousavi, can you tell us what the significance is of this deal between China and Iran?
Well, I think essentially it is showing the international community that Iran has other options aside from the United States. With the breakdown of the 2015 nuclear deal, Iran's foreign policy has shifted toward the east. Iran's pivot to the east, if you'd like. So Iran has become closer to Russia and to China. And I think this is significant in the sense that it shows us a taste of what's to come, because essentially we're moving from a unipolar world to a multipolar world, where the United States is not the only great power in the international community. And this deal is essentially, if you look at the details that have come out, the entire deal has not been published, of course. But the details that have emerged shows that China is going to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in Iran, and Iran is going to sell its oil to China for the next 25 years. And of course, this is in defiance of US sanctions. So in that sense, I think it is also going to give Iran leverage when it is negotiating with the United States regarding the resurrection of the Iranian nuclear deal.
There's kind of almost always going to be sanctions of some kind between the United States and Iran. So will the success of this deal depend on the level of US sanctions?
I think it is definitely going to be impacted by US sanctions. Nevertheless, even right now, where the Iranian nuclear deal is essentially in shambles, Iran is actually able to export its oil to China. And we're hearing reports of 800,000, 900,000 barrels a day being exported to China as we speak. So I think the sanctions are going to make life difficult. Nevertheless, they're not going to make the implementation of the deal impossible. We have to also look at this deal not only through an economic lens, because the deal also entails military and security cooperation. And I think in this regard, this is what has been causing alarm in Washington. They have seen this deal as a cause of concern. And I think the reason for that is because they are understanding that essentially the so-called maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration, what it has done is it has pushed Iran towards the Eastern camp.
Does this deal end the dollar's hegemony in the world?
So I think there's definitely elements of that in the deal, and this is partly due to the United States' own policy. When the United States sanctions countries such as Iran as well as China, as happened very severely during the Trump administration, then it is only very understandable for these countries to find alternative means of financial transactions. And in that regard, in the long run, the Americans are actually shooting themselves in the foot, because if this continues and if this extends to other countries, then the hegemony of the American dollar, which is one of the most important elements of US hegemony in the world, will be weakened and perhaps even defeated. And I think this is why the US Democrats are very wary of the policies that were implemented by the Trump administration during those 4 years, both towards Iran and towards China. Nevertheless, we have to still wait and see whether those policies will actually change, because changing those policies by the Biden administration actually has a lot of enemies at home. So even though the Biden administration campaigned on changing those kinds of policies, perhaps, unfortunately, these policies might continue into the future.
Duncan, I didn't raise with you the issue of the dollar's hegemony and how that is affected by this. But if you think about it, that level of funding, $400 billion, none of it in dollars, is significant, isn't it?
And it's part of a bigger picture by China, of course, because the professor mentioned in that interview from Tehran the Belt and Road Initiative. This is the system by which China is going into many other countries, forming economic partnerships in which the deals are done in Chinese yuan or renminbi. And that means that then China offers investment in infrastructure, things like ports and railways, and particularly in telecoms and in IT and communications. But China always wants something in return. And it's very clear what it wants in return from Iran, and that's this oil over the very long term, 25 years. But there's another thing going on in China at the moment, which is that it's promising to become carbon neutral by 2060. So I see a dichotomy here. Because on the one hand, China is saying, we're getting greener, we want to cooperate with the international community in reducing the impact of climate change, we ourselves are suffering because of global warming, but at the same time, it's committing to using fossil fuels for another generation.
Dr. Mousavi, what's the benefit for China in this agreement?
Well, I think China, through the One Belt, One Road initiative, is trying to increase its economic as well as strategic influence through the entire globe. And if you look at the map for that initiative, Iran is actually situated in a very important place, essentially connecting Asia towards Europe. And I think by China, by investing in Iran, while the Americans, of course, do not have any influence here, essentially they will have a powerful ally in one of the most strategic areas of the globe, being the Middle East, on their side. So I think it is also to the benefit of China. Also, we have to understand that there are also economic benefits, because the Chinese through this deal are going to receive, they're going to buy Iranian oil at a discount. And we know that China imports over 60% of its oil needs. So from that perspective, I think the deal is beneficial for both sides.
Dr. Mousavi, can you tell us why do so many Iranian people still look west?
So I think there are perhaps two reasons that brought a lot of criticism regarding this deal. First of all was that it wasn't negotiated in a very transparent manner. And I think had the deal's details been completely published, then perhaps it would have actually answered many of these criticisms. But the fact that it wasn't published in full, it actually allowed a lot of rumors to be spread around. For example, in Iran, there were rumors that according to the deal, the Iranian island resort of Kish would be handed over to the Chinese, which was, of course, completely false. And these kinds of rumors spread around the country. The second issue was that this deal was supposed to be reached a year ago. And I think had this happened, many of the criticisms we're seeing today would not have taken place. But fundamentally speaking, both outside and inside Iran, there are both academics, policymakers, as well as ordinary people who argue that we shouldn't become closer to the East, rather we should fix our relations with the Americans. And essentially, if we're putting aside the Iranian revolutionary slogan of neither East nor West, then if we're picking a side, we might as well pick the Western side because of various reasons. Maybe it's better for development. Some people argue that even culturally, we're closer to them. And I think this brought a lot of criticism, especially from the reformist camp in Iran, which are more inclined to have views of better relations with the Americans, and hopefully they are advocating of reaching a deal with the United States. And in that regard, they are saying that essentially we don't need China, and they are seeing today's conditions as perhaps temporary. And because of those issues, there was a lot of debate within Iran of whether this deal is beneficial to Iran. There was also questions of perhaps it was bringing Iran under the so-called quote unquote sphere of influence of China. And we have to understand that from Iran's perspective of historically being invaded by great powers, Iranians are very wary of, coming under the influence of a foreign power. And the so-called rumors that of saying that, Kish Island was either being handed to the Chinese. There was also rumors that Iran was handing over all the fishery it had in the Persian Gulf to the Chinese. This created some anger among certain circles, but essentially most of those, perhaps even all of those rumors turned out to be not true.
Remarkably candid from Professor Mousavi in Tehran. Much more coming up after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalimahora with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, but discussing Iran and China. Zayd, the professor's remarkably candid, not so thinly veiled criticisms of the way this was negotiated by the Iranian government. What's your take on that?
Well, I do believe it's a fair point, and some Iranians are genuinely scared, let's say, of secretive negotiations taking place, and they have guarded against anyone meddling or interfering in their internal affairs, and they have proved dramatic resilience in actually standing up to anyone who wants to compromise or make any concessions which would jeopardize their national security. I do believe that negotiating and keeping their negotiations secret is actually a good idea, considering that the US has gone out of its way, and also the Europeans, to throw spanners in the work, to scupper the plans or any remote chance of arriving at a concrete strategic partnership. We've heard the US and the European actually being deeply alarmed, and such a announcement have sent shockwaves right across the US, because they do believe that such a strategic partnership with China, and also if Russia comes in, then that would change dramatically the balance of power, shift the balance of power in the region, particularly that Iran is there, China is close, and Russia have already established a foothold in Syria and has managed to turn the tables on the Saudi-driven initiative to topple the government in Syria and to install a puppet government. That's why I do believe that in those sort of circumstances, and let's not forget that even when America negotiated, because before the 2015 nuclear deal and the negotiations took place in Oman, they were actually highly secretive, because they knew fully well that if Saudi Arabia knows about it, then it will try every trick in the book, go to any length to actually sabotage, torpedo such negotiations. So it is important to bear that in mind, although I do believe that some details of this strategic partnership should be actually declared to the Iranian people, although I do believe that a lot of the accusations of complete selling out of sovereignty, of Iranian independence, are actually merely false accusations. If they are coming from the West, they do try their absolute best to derail any such partnership. And we have a clear example of what happened in Iraq. Iraq, actually, the previous government, led by Adel Abdel Mahdi, have signed a similar strategic partnership with China.
That's why he's no longer the Prime Minister.
That's why he was toppled by the Americans, using in a way that was inspired by Trump, but totally financed and sponsored by Saudi Arabia to install a puppet government in Iraq.
Let's get the view from Beijing. Dr. Einar Tangen is a political and economic affairs commentator. Dr. Einar, welcome to the show.
George, it was a pleasure.
Doctor, from your standpoint, what's the significance of this deal between China and Iran?
Well, it's a formalization of something that's been happening for quite some time. Obviously, Iran has been turning away, or has been turned away from the West. They don't feel that there's much hope of any kind of rapprochement. And as a result, they have been pursuing a turn east policy. And obviously, a large part of that is with China. China is a consumer of oil. Obviously, Iran needs markets for its oil. And China is large enough to kind of counterbalance the economic pressure that the U.S. is putting on. For China, Iran is strategically located. It gives another outlet through the borders to get to other areas that eventually leads to North Africa, the Middle East, and also Europe. So it's strategic for both sides. It's been a while coming. There's not always been a very smooth relationship between Tehran and Beijing. But it seems that under the pressure, both feel from the United States that they are coming together. This is probably the exact opposite of what Washington intended, but you see the same things happening with Russia as well.
Well, speculation says that China is going to invest $400 billion in Iran, and in return, Iran will sell China oil at a discounted rate. But that's about all we know, even if that is necessarily entirely true. Why is it so opaque, this whole thing?
Well, I mean, part of it I would believe is political. I am not as familiar with Iranian politics. I do appear on Iranian TV, but mostly to talk about Chinese issues. You have the government saying, look, we have a coup. We have arranged a solid conduit for our oil and for our trade that gets us around the United States. So obviously from their side, it's political. China is interested mostly in the trade. They would, as I said, they're very interested in the Belt and Road Initiative. This is a key alternative. It allows them to have an alternate to the situation with Russia. So they have more, they don't have one conduit where they are kind of boxed in. I know that they're getting closer to Russia, but I think there's always some concern that you don't want to be sole sourced on any kind of project of this size. Remember, the Belt and Road Initiative was created in essence to fend off this idea that China could be bottlenecked by some sort of kind of naval blockade or actions in the South China Seas or at certain strategic trade points. And they, for strategic reasons, they didn't want to be pushed into confrontation with the United States because the U.S. was blockading them because they see them as an existential threat because of their success. So having land routes is very, very strategic to China, not only from the point of view of having an outlet, but also in trying to create a more peaceful and harmonious area around it, not only for trade, but also for stability. The Chinese believe very strongly that the more stable the countries are around them, the less likely they are going to be interested in war or in social instability.
Doctor, the US is unlikely to give up the long habit of imposing sanctions of some kind on Iran. So will the success of this deal depend on what level those US sanctions are?
Well, let's break down those sanctions. The ones that are most crippling to Iran are actually the financial ones. The United States indirectly controls the SWIFT banking system. They have demonstrated that, much to the chagrin, not only of Iran and China and Russia, but also the Europeans. And you've also seen it with countries in South America, not just Venezuela, but other countries. There was a kind of implicit promise that when the SWIFT system, the basis by which banks can transfer money to each other and basically conclude international transactions, that it would never be weaponized, that the United States would not use it as a blunt instrument to get its way. But under Obama first, then Trump, it became a weapon of financial resort. And it's been used consistently against any country that now the U.S. sees as adversarial. And there now is a tremendous move by any number of countries. China's in the advance of creating not only digital currencies that would be outside this traditional banking structure, but also efforts to just have separate structures itself. So it's one of those kind of Pyrrhic victories. The U.S. has been very successful in the short term, but it remains to be seen whether this will have very serious effects on the hegemony of the U.S. dollar. If countries develop their own systems, obviously they don't need the U.S. dollar, and that could have really profound effects, especially on America. Right now, American debt is in essence underwritten by the vast dollar reserves that are held for trade by different individuals, companies, and governments. In U.S. treasuries, if that was to go away, you would see a sharp spike in the the yields of bonds and therefore the cost of U.S. debt, and that could be extremely crippling to the U.S. government. In addition to a lackluster dollar, which is being competed against by a various basket of currencies.
Duncan, so much in that to unpack and so little time. The standout for me, because it applies not just to the relationship between China and Iran, is this extraordinary, almost fantasy notion that the United States can extraterritorially sanction other people. So in other words, it doesn't just sanction me and you as American citizens from doing business with Iran. It seeks to punish you and me as foreign citizens from doing business with Iran. This is overreach, isn't it?
Well, I wonder how much longer those sanctions, which are led by the US on Iran, are going to last. And then suddenly into all this come the Chinese. People were asking, well, why isn't there more details about this comprehensive strategic partnership? I think I understand why. Of course the Chinese want to keep their cards close to their chest at this time, because they don't know, and nobody knows quite yet, what's going to be the outcome of those negotiations in Vienna. Because if the sanctions are lifted, partly or even completely, by the Americans, that will be a game changer.
It will, won't it, Maedeh? And it will strengthen those who were referred to by Dr. Mousavi in his presentation, who would rather lean towards the West than to the East. After all, it was the original Iranian slogan, neither West nor East. Yeah. But they're being forced East because of hostility in the West. If that hostility ends, will signing over your oil for 25 years seem still like such a good idea?
Well, when you look at it in retrospect of the Middle East, it is a good idea because China has similar deals with Saudi Arabia, Iraq. It's increased its imports from Qatar and the UAE. And Saudi Arabia has actually emerged as a top supplier of oil for China. So I think it would still be relevant. But of course, Javid Zarif this year has reiterated that they don't want to look northeast nor west. But again, the sanctions force them to look east. I don't think this deal will completely go out of the window. I think, again, it is a signal of intent of what will happen once the sanctions are removed. And when they are removed, because at the moment they do make trade difficult, and some Chinese businesses could view Iran as a liability at the moment. 2 years ago, the founder, daughter of the founder of Huawei, was facing fraud charges in the US for dealing in Iran. So at the moment, there could still be some hesitancy for Chinese enterprise to go into the Iranian market. But of course, when the sanctions are lifted, it's no longer as much of a risk. So I don't believe the deal will be completely undermined or thrown out the window. The reason it is generic, I think, I believe, is because last year when it was leaked, there was a huge uproar, and this was stirred by Iranians. And the reason another reason why it has not been published, according to the Iranian government, is because it is, at the end of the day, a non-binding document, and it's more of a framework and a roadmap. And it is uncommon for these types of documents to be published.
We all know about waiting for Godot. How long are some Iranians going to wait for the West? They've been waiting for more than 40 years for this welcoming embrace from the West. Even if these sanctions are lifted, even more if they're only partly lifted, why do so many Iranian people still look West? Why do they see themselves as more American than Russian, for example?
Yeah, so well, I think, for example, with the COVID-19 vaccine, the most recent example, a lot of Iranians voiced their opinion that they would trust the Western vaccine rather than the Russian. I think that
even though the Russian's better.
Yeah, I know. I think this is to do with just like our earlier expert said, is they feel culturally closer to the West, perhaps.
Yeah, but why?
But again, it's interesting.
Because the West doesn't want anything to do with them,
yeah,
so
and
why?
It's interesting because when you look at their experience with the West, it hasn't been the best from back with their colonial experience and with their natural reserve concessions. They've had a democratically elected government overthrown by the West. So it is interesting, and most of the Iranian government do not even view the West as a reliable partner, as they have proven themselves by coming out of the deal in the first place. But I don't have the answer to why Iranians do actually trust the West or are leaning to the West more.
Is it, Duncan, a Coca-Cola thing that Coca-Cola might not be better than Chinese cola? I wouldn't drink either of them, but Coca-Cola's got the X factor that Iranians look West, even though, as Maedeh said, the experience of the West long before the Iranian Revolution was absolutely horrific. Britain occupied Iran and sucked it dry of its petroleum resources. And when a government was elected in Iran that wanted to do something about that, we overthrew it. Why would an Iranian look West and wish they had more to do with the West than the East?
Well, this conversation is really about the relationship between China and Iran, isn't it? And that's been on good terms for 50 years. You know, China and Iran opened their diplomatic relationship in 1971. And
under the Shah.
Indeed, and with very different geopolitical circumstances in those days. But China has continued to supply Iran with weapons as well during that time. And if you look at the geopolitical picture at the moment, what we see, of course, is America trying to strengthen its relationships with its friends and allies, perhaps repair broken relationships or relationships that were damaged under Trump. So you can see America drawing closer to countries like Japan and the United Kingdom. But on the other side, China is trying to consolidate its relationship with its long-term friends, with Russia and with Iran. Each of these big powers are trying to pull other countries into their sphere of influence. This creates many dilemmas, of course, particularly for small nations. And the dilemmas, I think, are acute in the Middle East because of those difficult historical circumstances which you just alluded to.
The outcome of all of this will be what, in your expert opinion?
Well, I think it'll be a good deal for China. China always talks about a win-win situation. And actually, in my experience, very often that means China wins twice. It's easy to see what the short-term benefit for Iran is, which it means that it's going to be able to get that money to come in to rebuild its infrastructure. But overall, where's that going to leave Iran in terms of its relationships with the rest of the region and the rest of the world? So I still have some questions in my mind about whether it increases stability, both in the region and internationally.
We saw Iranian oil being exported to Venezuela and being intercepted by US warships and boarded. I hazard a guess that won't happen to the tankers headed for China?
Well, I don't think so. I think China's plan is to try to keep the region stable and not to provoke the Americans too much. I think behind the scenes, although they probably Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, wouldn't want to say it publicly, he'll be hoping that there's a good diplomatic outcome to the negotiations between Iran and the US and the partners that are taking place in Vienna. Because China hopes that it can do business. It doesn't have a very big security and it doesn't want to become the policeman for the Middle East. It recognises that at the moment, particularly with the upsurge in violence between Israel and Palestine, there's still a lot of instability in the region. It would just quietly like to maintain its relationships, do the business and still be kept in respect by the leaders, even if there's a change in leadership in Iran, which we expect later on this year.
Quietly, but less quietly than before. That's fair enough, isn't it?
It is more assertive. It is definitely trying to win friends and influence people.
Doctor, part of the agreement is using the Chinese currency, the yuan, instead of the dollar. Is this the beginning of the end for the dominance of the dollar in the world?
Well, yes, and it would have to be because you want to get around this, the current SWIFT system. China has one bank that deals extensively with Iran, and they're in essence sanctioned by the U.S., but they don't care because they don't do any business outside that relationship. So yes, by widening the relationship and doing it in yuan, I mean, this is the first step, major step that China is taking to create an international yuan. Remember, China is the primary trade relationship for over 120 different countries. Just sheer logic will tell you that the idea that you and I are trading, but we're going to trade in a third currency, and each one of us is taking a certain amount of forex risk, the exchange rate risk, while the transaction is being completed. If that currency is not seen as stable, right, then there's no reason to use it. And right now, the dollar, it does not look tremendously stable with the kind of debt that's out there, with inflation knocking on the door. Whereas China has a viable economy. Actually, the inflows, FDI inflows over a period of a couple of years has been $3 trillion. Working economy has dealt well with COVID, both in terms of the medical and apparently also very well in terms of the financial. Knock on wood, there's always something that could go wrong, but so far they've had a very good handle on things. That's what gives people confidence. And if you want to get right down to it, paper money is a fiat, and it depends on confidence. So yes, this deal is advancing, the internationalization of the yuan, in particular the electronic yuan, because I do believe that in the details later on you'll find that this is the way to do it.
Zayd, the outcome of all of this will be what, in your view?
I do believe that the sanctions, albeit not all the sanctions, because America has been dragging its feet about actually separating or distinguishing between sanctions which had been imposed because of the nuclear issue and other issues like human rights and so-called, which has been used as a weapon by America in order to use it and exploit it against those countries who do not toe the American line. I do believe that both China and Russia has learned their lessons. They have learned the lesson the hard way. They've seen America impose those relentless, monstrous sanctions against Iran on and off for the last 40 years. And they were willing to actually adhere to the American will, comply with America, and participate in those sanctions. Now they have seen clearly that when Iran has abided by the terms of conditions of the 2015 nuclear deal, it was the only power actually who stuck to the terms and conditions. We've seen the Europeans actually being happy, sitting on the fence, not carrying out their obligation, playing part of the good cop role while Trump was playing the bad cop role. We've seen that Russia and China now witnessing and seeing clearly that the sanctions are expanding, and the Americans are widening the net of the sanctions, and they haven't been restricted only to the Trump administration.
Maedeh, the last word to you. Do you think this is all going to work out? And if it is, what will its long-term impact be on Iranian society and indeed on, as you touched earlier, the relationship between Iran and its neighbors?
I think in terms of Iran and its neighbors, I don't think China would do anything to jeopardize its relationship with neighbors in Iran that Iran finds hostile, for example, Israel and Saudi. So China also has very good relations with Israel and Saudi, and of course Israel was a bit annoyed at the deal. And going forward, I think the deal can materialize in a very beautiful way, as it has with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, etc. But that all depends on whether sanctions are uplifted. At the moment, so there is this consensus that Iranian oil is being sold to China through Malaysia, so it gets rewrapped mid-ship as Malaysian oil. And recent figures that have coincided with the signing of the deal shows a huge increase in imported Malaysian oil. And if that Malaysian oil is in fact Iranian oil, then we are already seeing the benefits of the deal. But I believe the deal will show its true fruits once we lift the sanctions, and it's both Iran and China have made it clear is in both their interests, and China is.
Have you any idea what the discount on the oil is? I mean, because A discount of X% might look like a good deal for Iran today, but if sanctions are lifted, that discount may not look like a good deal for Iran tomorrow.
I don't have much information on the discount.
No one really does,
Chinese Foreign Ministry himself said there's no end goal, there's no numbers, etc. A lot of the numbers that have been coming out, whether it's the $400 billion deal, etc., they've not been really sourced quite well, so no one really has much information on the numbers specifically. And people are still actually trying to find out how Iranian oil even reaches China. So yeah, I have no idea on the numbers at the moment.
Duncan, you any idea?
No, of course.
You see my point? A discount today might not actually be in your interest tomorrow.
Well, exactly, and that's why I think the details of this deal have been left to speculation. But I mean, you know, $400 billion, who's going to check where that money's been spent? That's the key thing, isn't it? So let's say, for example, China says, well, what we'll do first of all is we'll rebuild your telecoms infrastructure. Does that mean Huawei comes in and builds masts all around the Iranian cities? Is that going to work? And then what are the implications of that? Because one of the things that the Chinese often do with their own telecommunications network is that they use it as a means to spread the government's messages. They also use it as a means to track the activities of their citizens.
You make me laugh.
Is that what the Iranians intend to do as well?
Perhaps the Iranians will act like every other government in the world acts. And perhaps the elite in Iran will benefit more than the poor, as happens in every other country in the world. Thank you, Duncan. Thank you all. I've been George Galloway. This is Al Mayadeen Television, where kalima horra is the word of the day. Thank you for watching.